Welcome, weary traveler of thoughts, to a place where time drifts slowly, like sand through a quiet hourglass, and memory rests gently in the corners of a peaceful room. You have found your way to yet another installment of boring history for sleep, forgotten tales of ancient India. Tonight, we begin a long and uneventful journey, a tale with no heroes and no climaxes, a story stretched across centuries, where things happen slowly, if they happen at all. Let us begin, not in the middle, nor at the end, but somewhere quietly near the beginning. Not the very beginning, of course, because no one really knows when that was. Some say around 3300 BCE, others say earlier, but those are just numbers, and numbers can wait. We will drift slowly into the Indus Valley civilization, not because it's particularly exciting, but simply because it was there, a long, long time ago. It was a place where people built things, and then forgot about them. In the northwest of what is now India and Pakistan, there were cities. The people of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro built cities with drains. That is what they are most remembered for, not for war or conquest, but for drains and bricks. Bricks that were baked, not sun-dried. This, apparently, was important. They organized their cities in grids, neat, dull grids, the kind that make you want to close your eyes and rest your mind. And perhaps they had no kings. Or if they did, the kings did not leave much behind. No grand monuments, just weights, seals, pottery, and scripts that no one can read. That script, still undeciphered, tells us little, and whispers even less. But before we get there, let us pause and take a moment to think about bricks. A brick is a humble thing, square, heavy, useful. The bricks of the Indus Valley were standardized, almost obsessively so, with a 4:2:2:1 ratio length, width, height. That meant something, or maybe it didn't. These bricks were used to build houses. Some of the houses had wells, private wells, and bathrooms, and that tells us something about priorities. Even then, people cared about bathing. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro was not all that great, but it was a bath, surrounded by rooms, possibly for rituals, or just sitting. No one is quite sure. Now let's take a small detour and talk about seals. Not the animals, but small carved tokens, made of steatite, soft, smooth, easily carved. Many of them had pictures of animals, bulls, elephants, unicorns, not real unicorns of course, stylized ones, with one horn. The seals also had writing, but again, no one knows what it says. Perhaps it said, "This belongs to me," or "This was traded here," or maybe it said nothing. The civilization lasted a long while, then it faded, slowly, without a bang. No grand fall, just a slow, gradual decline. Perhaps rivers changed course, perhaps trade dwindled, or the bricks stopped being made. Some say it mattered, others forgot entirely. From the ashes of stillness, we move to the Vedic period, around 1500 BCE when new people came, or maybe they were always there. These were the people who spoke early Sanskrit. They composed hymns called the Vedas, long verses about God's fire and order, spoken not written for centuries, passed from one sleepy mouth to another. The Vedas describe rituals, offerings poured into fire, chanted lines, sacred sounds, no great cities, no bricks, just words, and cows. Many cows. Cows were wealth, a symbol of abundance, and later reverence. The society was tribal, and slowly settled kings appeared. So did priests and warriors, and farmers. The four Varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, a system, or maybe a poem. It's hard to say. Let us linger here. With this early order, time moved slowly. Villages grew, clans fought sometimes, but often they just lived. Life was measured by harvests, by festivals, by the position of the sun, and the phases of the moon. But before we drift further, we must mention something dull but foundational. The Sanskrit language, its grammar, codified by Panini much later, was extremely precise, too precise perhaps, so precise that it preserved the old sounds, long after people stopped using them, like an echo in a forgotten hallway. Let us pause here, just for now, before we move on to the next slow unfolding of centuries. And now, let us continue. Ever so gently, we wander into the later Vedic period. Time, like a river, keeps flowing, but very, very slowly. The tribes became kingdoms, Janapada's land of the people. They grew quietly, small realms ruled by righteous kings, of varying importance. The rituals became more complex, the priests more powerful. The Brahmins held knowledge, or claimed to, knowledge of chants, of sacrifice, of the placement of sacred fire. It was all very detailed, and very slow. Agriculture expanded, iron tools helped. Slowly, the forests were cleared, inch by inch. Rice was cultivated more often. In the eastern plains, more food meant more people. More people meant more rules. New texts emerged. The Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and finally, the Upanishads. The latter asked questions. What is the self? What is the universe? Where do we go when we sleep? Some answers were given, others were left open, to float in the air like mist. Let's take a slow detour into one of those questions. What is Atman, the self, the breath, the inner spark, and Brahman, the vast, the unchanging? Are they one? Are they separate? The sages debated quietly on riverbanks, under trees, between silences. As centuries passed, some Janapadas grew larger, into Mahajanapadas, 16 of them, more or less. Names like Kasala, Magadha, Kuru, Panchala. They appeared in texts, in dry records. They taxed, they waged small wars. They built cities, sometimes. And now, we arrive, not suddenly, but inevitably, at Magadha, a kingdom in the east, rich in iron and elephants. It slowly became important, under kings like Bimbisara, then Ajutashatru. They built forts, dug moats, formed alliances, or broke them. Buddha lived during this time. So did Mahavira. They wandered, taught, sat beneath trees. The kingdoms, meanwhile, carried on, slowly. Eventually, a man named Chandragupta rose. No one knows exactly how. He may have met Alexander's men. He may have wandered first. But slowly, he took over Makuta and more. With help, perhaps, from a man named Chanaka, a thinker, a strategist, a quiet mind with long plans. And so, the Maurya Empire began. Around 321 BCE, its capital Pataliputra, a city by a river, full of wooden houses, administrative offices, grain stores. It stretched far, from Bengal to Afghanistan, but it did so, over time, not all at once. Let's take a moment to discuss the Arthashastra, a text attributed to Chanaka. It spoke of statecraft, spies, taxes, duties, fines. It was detailed and very precise, but also very dry. A guide for kings perhaps followed, perhaps not. Chandragupta abdicated. He became a Jain, gave up his throne, walked south, lived in silence, or so they say. His son Bimbisara ruled after. Then came Ashoka, the most remembered of the Mauryas. But even his story unfolds gently. Ashoka fought a war in Kalinga. It was terrible, they say. Afterward, he changed or began to. Slowly he turned to Buddhism. Not overnight, but over years. He issued edicts on stone, on pillars, in many languages, about kindness, and duty, and compassion. His empire endured, and then declined. As all things do, slowly, by the time of his great-grandchildren, it had become smaller and quieter, until it ended. Then came the Shungas, then the Canvas. Minor dynasties, little remembered, less recorded, and then silence, for a while. But not for long. In time, new kingdoms rose. In the north, in the south, in the center. One of them was Gupta. Let us pause here. Before we wander into the next gentle chapter, let your thoughts drift, like a quiet leaf, on a slow river. The Indian subcontinent, as we now call it, wasn't always where it is. Plate tectonics, which are not especially thrilling to watch, slowly pushed the land northward, inch by inch, over millions of years. Imagine watching paint dry, only much, much slower. Eventually, this chunk of crust collided with another chunk, and the Himalayas creased upward like a rumpled bedspread. They're still rising, but very politely. Somewhere between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, a range as vague as it is large, people started farming near rivers. The Saraswati and the Indus were two such rivers, though one of them may not have existed, or may still exist underground, or may have once existed but now just shows up in poetry. Either way, seeds were planted, and then, very slowly, something grew. What grew is what we now call the Indus Valley civilization. It had cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which sound impressive but probably involved a lot of waiting for things to happen. The people built things from bricks, all the same size, which seems like a bureaucratic achievement. The cities had drains. That's right, drains, covered ones, which tells you something about their priorities. Order, cleanliness, possibly a fear of open sewers. They wrote in symbols. We don't know what they meant. Scholars still argue. Some say it was a language. Others say it was just decorative. Some think it's both, or neither. But before we get there, let's linger a moment longer. But again, slowly. Always slowly. Their cities were regular, square, aligned with the cardinal directions. This suggests planning, or at least, someone somewhere cared a great deal about right angles. Houses faced inward. The streets were not chaotic. It may have been very boring to live there, which, depending on your goals, might be ideal. There were no palaces, no grand temples, no obvious signs of kings, just standardized bricks and a lot of silence. Some say that's a sign of equality. Others say it's just that we haven't dug up the fancy parts yet. Regardless, the civilization faded, possibly due to changing rivers, possibly climate, possibly something more interesting that we'll never know. Let's take a small detour to the Vedic age. It followed the Indus, though not directly. The Vedas, a collection of hymns, were composed orally. That means they were spoken, and remembered, and passed down, for centuries, without being written. Imagine telling a bedtime story that lasts 1,000 years, and making sure every word stays exactly the same. These hymns spoke of rituals, of gods, of fire, lots of fire. Agni, the fire god, shows up frequently. He liked butter, apparently. Clarified butter, or ghee, was poured into flames. This was important, possibly sacred, or maybe just a way to use surplus dairy. Society slowly organized itself into categories, later called varnas. Brahmins chanted, Kshatriyas ruled, Vaishyas traded, Shudras served, but these roles were more fluid early on. Only later would they harden into something more rigid. Language shifted too. Sanskrit emerged, a language so well structured that even computers admire it. But again, slowly, with drift, like sediment settling in water. There were kingdoms, eventually Janapadas, and later Mahajanapadas, names that now echo faintly, like forgotten towns on old maps. Kosala, Magadha, Kuru, Panchala, each with its own quiet ambitions. And then came empires. But perhaps we should pause here. Let the dust settle on the Janapadas a bit longer. In Magadha, a man named Mahavira wandered. So did Gautama, later called the Buddha. They questioned things. Mahavira taught Jainism, emphasizing non-violence. So much non-violence, in fact, that some Jainas today sweep the ground as they walk, so as not to harm even the tiniest of insects. The Buddha spoke of suffering and how to end it. His path involved 8 parts, none of them particularly hurried. Right view, right intention, right speech, and so on. Each a step on a very long and very deliberate walk toward something called nirvana, not the band, the state. Ashoka was an emperor. He ruled a lot of land after some battles. The Battle of Kalinga in particular was bloody, but then he felt bad about it, very bad, and he converted to Buddhism. He carved his remorse into rocks and pillars, which are still standing, mostly. He told people to be kind, to avoid killing, to live simply. His messages were in multiple languages, to be more inclusive. Some say he was India's greatest emperor. Others barely remember him. That's how history works. The Maurya Empire faded. The Gupta Empire rose later. It was a time of what some call a golden age, though, like most golden ages, it probably involved more administrative paperwork than gold. There was math, decimal points, 0, Sanskrit drama, poetry, law codes, philosophy, observatories. It was a time when people thought a lot and wrote those thoughts down. The Indian plate, a piece of the Earth's crust, wandered slowly as crust does, toward the north. Over tens of millions of years, it crept like a very lazy pilgrim and bumped into Asia. This meeting created the Himalayas. They continue to rise, a few millimeters every year, which is hardly noticeable, but they do rise, still. The land settled into place, and in time, the climate allowed for life, and eventually for humans. Somewhere between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, early inhabitants began to stay in one place for a little while longer than before. They tilled the soil. They tried their hand at farming wheat, barley, lentils, possibly. Villages grew near rivers. The Indus was one such river. Another was the Gagar, which some have linked with the Saraswati, though its waters may have dried up or sunk underground, or never existed as imagined. It doesn't matter much now. People lived, they made pottery, red and black ware, geometric shapes, nothing too fancy. Then came the Harappan phase, a slow and sturdy civilization, with towns laid out in neat grids. Mohenjo-daro and their bricks were baked to uniform size. There were drainage systems, granaries, wells. The cities suggest quiet order, not loud authority. There are seals with animals, often the humped bull, and symbols we still cannot read. Some say it was a script, others think it was just pictures. But before we try to decode them, let's take a long pause to appreciate that we may never know. The Harappans did not leave behind dramatic stories. No great battles, no declarations, no pyramid-like monuments, just carefully planned towns, which may have meant they valued consistency more than charisma. Then over time, the cities faded. Some say the rivers changed course. Others say the land grew less fertile. Some suspect trade routes shifted. And then came the Vedic period, named for the Vedas' long hymns composed in a language called Early Sanskrit. These hymns were not written down for centuries. They were memorized, recited, passed along from teacher to student, like a very long lullaby whispered across generations. The Vedas speak of fire rituals. The sacred fire was central. Offerings were made to the gods, not just any offerings, but clarified butter, ghee, poured slowly into the flames. This was not for cooking, this was for communion. The gods, they believed, smelt the offerings in the smoke. Society settled into 4 broad roles. Brahmins were the priests, Kshatriyas the warriors, Vaishyas traded and farmed, Shudras served. This wasn't rigid at first, but like many ideas, it slowly hardened. Over centuries, what was once a suggestion became a rule. Janapadas emerged regions with chieftains and councils. Some of these grew into Mahajanapadas, larger realms with armies and taxes, Magadha Kosala, Avante Vatsa. These names sound like whispers from another time. In Magadha, religious seekers like Mahavira and Gautama wandered. Mahavira, who followed the path of intense discipline, became the teacher of Jainism. He taught absolute nonviolence. Even a careless step might hurt a living being. So some followers swept the ground as they walked. Gautama became the Buddha. He left his palace to seek an end to suffering. After years of meditation, he found a quiet path, the middle way, not too hard, not too soft, just steady. He spoke of the Four Noble Truths. Life has suffering, there is a cause, there is an end, and there is a path. Ashoka ruled many years later. He was an emperor of the Mauryan Empire. He waged a bloody war in Kalinga, and afterward he felt regret. Deep, long, echoing regret. He turned to Buddhism. He had inscriptions carved into rocks and pillars, advising kindness, tolerance, and patience. Some pillars still stand, quiet sentinels with soft-edged letters. They do not shout, they murmur across time. The Mauryas faded, the Guptas came. A time called golden, not for its shine, but perhaps for its steady productivity. People wrote poetry, they calculated pi, they described the zero, they told stories of gods and long epics. And through it all, life moved slowly. Farmers farmed, teachers taught, children learned stories about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Gods walked the earth, or so the stories said, in the form of kings and warriors. But before we go there to the epics, let's pause again. Let the names settle in your mind. Let the centuries pass quietly, like clouds behind a mountain. The Ramayana, they say, is the story of a prince named Rama. He is exiled. He walks through forests. He loses his wife Sita to a demon king, Ravana. Then he retrieves her, but not all at once. The journey is long, full of pauses, detours, hermits, monkeys who talk, bridges made of stones that float. The tale stretches out, as if it enjoys the sound of its own footsteps. The Mahabharata is longer still, an epic with hundreds of characters, princes, sages, a war that lasts 18 days, but also long digressions, philosophical questions, morality debates. The Bhagavad Gita, a chapter within the epic, is just a conversation on a battlefield, but not a loud one, more like an internal monologue. Should I fight? What is duty? What is the self? Time passed. Dynasties rose and fell. The Cholas in the south, the Satavahanas in the Deccan. They built temples, issued coins, sent traders to Southeast Asia. None of this happened quickly. Ships took months to reach their destinations. Messages were sent on foot. Changes came like the wind slowly, from the distance, barely noticed until they arrived. And through all of it, ordinary life continued. Villages remained. Harvests came and went. People sang lullabies, spun thread, built homes from mud and memory. Somewhere along the way, new influences arrived. Traders from faraway lands, Greeks with questions, Persians with roads, Romans with coins. All these left traces, but nothing too overwhelming. India absorbed, reinterpreted, and moved on. But before we wander into the next centuries, let's rest a moment here. History is not a race. It is a place to sit and listen. Let us resume. Somewhere between the 4th and 8th centuries, temples began to rise more grandly. Stone took the place of wood. In the south, the Pallavas and the Chalukyas built shrines and carved gods into cave walls. Not all at once. Carvings took years, decades, one stone at a time. Some centuries passed without much fuss. Small kingdoms rose and fell. Local rulers, some remembered, some forgotten, maintained courts where poets recited verses and accountants tallied grain. The rhythm was mostly unbroken. Life was measured not in revolutions, but in harvests. The Kailasanatha temple in Ellora, for instance, was hewn from a single rock, not built, carved, slowly, from the top down. It is said to have taken hundreds of workers, working for years. No one rushed. There was no need. The gods, after all, had time. Religious ideas blended. Shaivism and Vaishnavism became prominent. Devotees sang devotional songs, bhajans that were composed in Tamil, in Kannada, in Marathi. The Bhakti movement grew slowly, like moss on stone. It offered a gentle revolution, not through violence, but through love. Some saints, like Andal, sang to Vishnu with the longing of a lover. Others, like Bazava, questioned caste and called for a quiet kind of equality. Their songs traveled not through armies, but through mouths and ears and hearts. They were carried, softly, from village to village. Meanwhile, in the north, waves of new rulers arrived. The Huns came, then the early Turks, then the Ghaznavids. These names sound harsh, but their rule often settled into local rhythms. Coins changed, but rice still grew. By the 12th century, Delhi began to emerge as a center. The Delhi Sultanate formed 5 dynasties, one after another: Mamluks, Khaljias, Tughlaqs, Soyids, Lodis. Some lasted decades, others only years. Policies shifted, but life, mostly, went on. Markets buzzed gently. Artisans made carpets and swords. Scribes copied manuscripts by hand, in Persian and Sanskrit. Travelers like Ibn Battuta passed through, marveling at the climate, the food, the customs. But for most people, the days were the same: sun up, sun down. The Lodis gave way to the Mughals. Babur came from the north. He wrote a diary. He liked gardens. Humayun slipped and fell on stairs. Akbar asked questions of scholars from all religions. He held debates, not to win, but to learn. He liked painting and elephants. Jahangir enjoyed nature. Nur Jahan ruled quietly beside him. Shah Jahan built monuments, not just the Taj Mahal, but also halls and mosques. Aurangzeb ruled longest. He expanded the empire, but the strain showed. After him, things loosened. Let's pause. There were Marathas rising, Sikhs forming a distinct identity, Rajputs holding on to fortresses. In the background, European traders arrived. First the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the English. Each came for spices. Each left deeper footprints. But that can wait. For now, let us breathe. And remember that most of history is not made by emperors or battles. It is made by the steady heartbeat of quiet lives, and the long hush between events. Let us continue. The British came slowly. At first, they were traders. The East India Company was just one among many, seeking pepper and cloth. They negotiated, bargained, sometimes tricked. Over time, they began to rule. Not all at once, but gradually, like a vine wrapping itself around a tree. They fought battles at Plassey, at Buxar, but the battles were brief. More important were the agreements, the treaties, the shifting loyalties of local rulers. The British collected taxes. They reorganized land. They introduced railways, telegraphs, and English schools. Not for everyone, just for a few. The few who could help the system work more smoothly. Protests grew, jails filled, the British tired. The Second World War drained resources. Afterward, the pressure became too much. In 1947, they left, but not cleanly. The land was partitioned. India and Pakistan were born. There was violence, trains of refugees, 1 million lost, a wound, not yet fully healed. There were revolts. The one in 1857, a Sepoy mutiny, or the First War of Independence, depending on who you ask. It was sudden and fierce, but also scattered, and it failed. The British Crown took direct control afterward. Queen Victoria promised order, and not interference in religion. The years passed. Some Indians became lawyers, clerks, teachers. They wrote essays, argued in English, asked for more say in governance. The Indian National Congress formed in 1885. It was not a revolution. It was a meeting, a petition, a request. Nationalism stirred slowly. There were poems, songs, speeches. Some wanted reforms, others wanted freedom. Gandhi arrived and suggested nonviolence. He walked, he spun thread. He said salt could be a symbol, not a sword. Salt. Still, life went on. A constitution was written. Elections were held. India remained a democracy. Imperfect, noisy, enduring. It grew, sometimes unevenly, sometimes surprisingly. New cities, new struggles, new dreams. Let us resume once more. When last we paused, Sails had begun to appear on the horizon, foreign ships catching the Indian breeze. The Portuguese were first. Landing near Calicut, Vasco da Gama stepped ashore, not with an army, but with spices on his mind. He was welcomed, then taxed, then tolerated. In time, the Portuguese built forts along the coast. Not large empires, more like stone footholds. Goa became their capital. They brought churches. They brought new crops, chilies, tobacco, cashews, things that would become part of the land's rhythm. After them came the Dutch, briefly, then the French, but neither stayed long enough to shape more than a few trading posts. It was the English, slow and persistent, who would stay longest, not as conquerors at first, just merchants, with ledgers, with ships, with measured politeness. They came through a company, the East India Company, not a king, not a state, a company with stockholders. It began with factories, which were warehouses, not workshops, in Surat, in Madras, in Calcutta. Quiet beginnings. But trade led to influence. Influence led to alliances. Alliances led eventually to control, not suddenly, bit by bit, with treaties and loans, with borrowed soldiers, with careful manipulation. In Bengal, after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, which was less a battle than a betrayal, the company gained real power. It became a shadow ruler. Nawabs remained, but only in name. The company collected taxes. It built its own army. Warren Hastings came, then Cornwallis, then Wellesley, administrators with crisp handwriting and concern for balance sheets. They introduced laws. They built roads. They also misunderstood much, but they kept records. So many records, so many reports, written in longhand, by candlelight. Famines occurred, some natural, some worsened by policy. The company prioritized exports, indigo, cotton, tea, things that did not feed the land but which lined ships and filled vaults. Rebellions happened, sannyasas rose, peasants protested, but the biggest shock came in 1857, a mutiny, a sepoy rebellion, an uprising. Call it what you will. It was loud for a moment and then quiet again. Delhi trembled. Lucknow held firm, but the British pushed back with force, and when it was over, the company was dissolved. The crown took over. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, a formalization of what had long been reality. So began the British Raj. Not because things stopped, but because the pace became even more complicated. Railways were built, schools opened, in English, in a new kind of order. Census forms counted heads, calendars changed, postal systems stretched like threads between towns. Some Indians joined the bureaucracy. They wore suits, took exams, debated in new languages. Others wrote poems about the loss of something hard to name, a softness, a rhythm, a familiar uncertainty. Newspapers appeared, movements formed, small at first, then growing. The Indian National Congress met in Bombay. It was not revolutionary. It was a discussion. Speeches read in calm voices, but seeds were being planted. Elsewhere, Swami Vivekananda spoke in Chicago. Tagore wrote poems about freedom, not loud freedom, but inner freedom, a liberation of the spirit. Factories rose, cotton mills in Bombay, jute mills in Calcutta. A working class began to form, though slowly. Most people still lived in villages. They grew crops, sent letters, sang lullabies, slept under stars. The Raj remained. It seemed eternal. But underneath, time was shifting, like tectonic plates, deep and unseen. Let's rest here. And remember, history does not need to shout. It can whisper and still be heard. India continued on, not with leaps, but with footsteps. After independence, the country had to learn, slowly, how to govern itself. There were debates in the new parliament, often long, sometimes circular. Laws were drafted, committees were formed, bureaucrats typed slowly on typewriters with ribbon ink. Nothing moved fast. It wasn't meant to. Villages received electricity sometimes. Roads were built, not always straight. People voted, sometimes not quite understanding the policies, but understanding that the vote mattered. Children learned to recite the preamble to the Constitution in schools, with dusty blackboards and chalk that squeaked. In the midst of this slow reshaping, there were leaders. Nehru with his rose and his plans for dams and factories. He spoke of science and progress, but also of ancient roots. After him came others, each leaving a mark, some gentle, some sharp. Indira Gandhi declared an emergency. Democracy paused and then resumed. Rajiv Gandhi looked to computers. Others followed. Each chapter was written in slow strokes, with long pauses in between. Meanwhile, the land remained old. Mountains stayed where they were. Rivers shifted only slightly. The Ganges kept flowing. People still gathered at its banks to pray, or to think, or just to sit. Villages modernized a little. Tractors appeared where oxen once tread. Mobile phones buzzed in pockets beside traditional shawls. Young people moved to cities. Some wrote code, others opened tea stalls. In big cities, towers rose slowly, casting long shadows over crowded lanes. And yet, much stayed the same. Temples echoed with morning bells. Mosques called the faithful. Churches sang hymns. Street vendors fried samosas. Life, though modern in parts, kept a familiar rhythm. India began sending satellites into space. It made movies, long ones, with songs in the middle. It won cricket matches that made millions cheer, then forget. It debated everything, from prices of onions to matters of the soul. But all this is no longer ancient history. It is not meant to be recited in a sleepy whisper, but rather read in today's paper. So let's return not to the noise of now, but to the hush of before. Let's go back to a quiet moment in time, when a teacher sat under a tree, speaking to students seated on the ground. No projector, no whiteboard, just stories about dharma, about duty, about the balance of things. The teacher may have paused often, to let the words settle, to let the breeze pass. Or let us imagine a grandmother by a lamp, telling tales in the flicker of the flame. Her voice was steady, her pace unhurried. She spoke of gods who took 10 forms of animals, who spoke in riddles, of brave queens and clever ministers. The child listening may have fallen asleep midway. That was expected. And somewhere else, a monk walked barefoot, with a bowl, not seeking attention, just a little food, and perhaps a quiet place to sit, to breathe. History is not only in what happened, it is also in what was felt. The long silences between events, the slow unfolding of meaning, the moments between moments. And yet the river of time continues to flow, gently, ever so slowly. After independence, as India shaped itself anew, its bureaucracy, vast and varied, grew like a banyan tree, sprawling, unmoving, offering shade but rarely surprises. The planning commissions deliberated with long reports, often too long to read in one sitting. 5-year plans were announced with optimism, measured not in days or weeks, but decades. Languages multiplied. The Constitution recognized many, each with its own script, stories, sayings. Children in school sometimes learned 3 or more languages, but conversations still returned to simple questions. Have you eaten? How is your mother? Politeness mattered more than policy. Let's take a small detour to the post offices. These quiet red buildings stood in every district, every alley. The postal worker knew each home. They delivered letters, sometimes by foot, sometimes on bicycle. Love letters, government forms, money orders, all in little envelopes, carried across time and dust. And trains, not fast ones, not sleek ones, but long, rattling ones with fans that squeaked and windows with no glass. Stations smelled of chai and rust. Announcements were always a little unclear, and yet people knew when to get on, when to get off. Entire lifetimes were spent boarding and alighting. Let us pause here to think of the clerks, sitting at desks, surrounded by ledgers, carefully drawing straight lines with rulers, filing papers in manila folders, punching attendance cards. Their days followed rhythms unchanged for decades. Small changes came, a computer here, an air conditioner there, but the heart of it stayed, slow, deliberate, predictable. In villages, evening still brought the sound of temple bells. Children still chased each other through mustard fields. Grandparents still told stories of partition, or of British times, or of how the rains were better once. Perhaps they were, or perhaps memory just prefers simplicity. In the libraries, some dusty, some barely visited old books remained on high shelves. Encyclopedias, census records, handwritten inventories, pages yellowed with time. Some say it mattered, others forgot entirely. Yet, the books were not thrown away. That would be too sudden, too final. Better to let them be. Television came, but it came slowly. Doordarshan, with its slow-moving newsreaders and long musical introductions. Ramayana and Mahabharata serials on Sunday mornings. Streets emptied. Families watched together, in stillness, the same stories their grandparents had heard by oil lamp. But before we go too far forward, let's circle back to the weavers, to those who worked quietly, with fingers moving like wind over cotton. In towns like Varanasi or Kanchipuram, looms clacked patiently. Saris took days to finish, sometimes weeks. Bright colors, intricate borders, not for speed, but for tradition. Patterns passed down, unspoken. The seasons changed, but always as expected. Mangoes ripened in summer. Monsoon clouds gathered with sighs. Autumn brought harvest festivals. Winter crept in with quiet fog. People waited, not with calendars, but with instinct. Political slogans were painted on walls. Faded, rewritten, faded again. Party symbols, a hand, a flower, a wheel, looked more like decorations than ideologies. Campaigns promised much, delivered slowly, if at all. Yet people still stood in line to vote, not because they were told to, but because it had become part of the rhythm. Census workers walked door to door, asking how many lived in each home, whether there was a toilet, what language was spoken. The answers didn't change much. Families grew slowly. Life remained familiar. Change was acknowledged, but not chased. And in the silence of the Himalayas, monks still meditated. In the sands of Rajasthan, camels still crossed slowly. In Kerala's backwaters, boats still glided like old thoughts across still mines. India, not the idea, but the feeling was like an old song, one that everyone knew a line or two of, but no one remembered completely. It hummed beneath daily chores, behind rituals, beneath headlines. Even today, when the world spins faster, parts of India still move like it always did. Tea poured from steel kettles into glasses that scald, slippers left at doorsteps, mosquito nets tucked under mattresses, fans turning slowly above. And when the power goes out, which it sometimes still does, candles are lit, conversations pause, and then resume. Life does not stop, it simply waits. And so we drift into the time of the Guptas, around 320 CE dynasty, named for a man called Gupta, but more known for Chandragupta I, a king who married well, into the Likovas. And from there, things grew, but slowly, as they always do. Samudragupta came next, a conqueror, they say, but also a poet. His deeds are inscribed on a pillar, the Allahabad pillar. It lists the kingdoms he defeated, the gifts he received, the tribute he took, but all of it happened without haste. The empire expanded, piece by piece. Then came Chandragupta II, also called Vikramaditya, a name wrapped in legend. He may have ruled from Ujjain or Patliputra. Coins show him slaying lions, but the people, they mostly traded, crafted, painted, and listened to stories. This time is often called a golden age, not because it glittered, but because things were stable. There were scholars. Kalidasa the poet, Aryabhata the mathematician. They wrote, they thought. Kalidasa wrote plays, long and lyrical. Aryabhata wrote about the stars, and the number 0, which was something and also nothing. Temples were built, with quiet stone carvings. Art was made, paintings at Ajanta caves with stories painted on walls. scenes from the Jataka tales about past lives of the Buddha, but they were fading even then, just as softly as they were painted. Trade continued, with Rome, with China. Goods moved, silks, spices, ideas, quietly across deserts and seas, and Buddhism spread east, gently, on ships and sandalwood. But even golden ages are slow to fade. The Guptas weakened. Huns came, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, like wind eroding stone. There were later Guptas, lesser ones. The empire became regions, the regions became names, and then, footnotes. India, by then, was many kingdoms. Again Harshavardhana ruled in the north, briefly, in the 7th century, then others, Pelas, Prataharas. And so, the early medieval period began, not with fanfare, but with gentle shifts. Kings came and went. Some ruled vast territories, others ruled only dreams. The land became a patchwork: temple towns, forest hermitages, stone shrines, wooden villages, a mosaic of slow transformations. In the south, temples grew larger, stone by stone. The Pallavas built at Mahabalipuram, short temples, carved with patience, and the Chalukyas at Badami, their pillars rose slowly, like thoughts stretching skyward. Then the Rashtrakutas builders of Ellora Kailasa temple, carved from a single rock. But even such grandness was slow in the making, and slower in the remembering. Let us take a small detour into the world of devotion. Bhakti, it began quietly, with poems, with songs, with saints who wandered. They sang not to kings, but to gods. Krishna, Shiva, Devi, names uttered softly in homes and fields. The Tamil Alvars and Nahanars, their verses flowed like lullabies, celebrating love, surrender, a path not of rituals, but of feeling, soft feeling, like twilight. In the north, temples stood too, some made of stone, others of time. The Gurya Repertiraharas built near Kwalio. The palace supported Nalanda, a monastery, a university, where monks debated and forgot what day it was. Trade routes continued, slowly overland. Maritime merchants moved with pepper, with cloth, with images of deities. They left behind coins and silence. Let us pause here, before we drift further into centuries that wait like unopened scrolls. Let your breath grow softer, as the temple bells fade into dusk. For now, we rest in the silence between dynasties, where history hums quietly, just beneath the surface. Good night. And as we lie in this quiet moment, we might think softly about the people who never made it into the pages of books. The potter shaping clay with patient fingers, the farmer listening for the right moment to sow, the weaver who followed threads like thoughts through the loom. They shaped the texture of life unnoticed, but constant. Before we finish tonight, imagine the slow unfolding of a manuscript. Palm leaves dried, trimmed, and tied with string, inscribed carefully with a metal stylus. Each letter a careful scratch in the surface. No rush, just patience. These texts waited, sometimes for centuries, to be read, or maybe never read again, but they existed. Let's take a small detour to a dusty path beside a forgotten temple, a place where time barely moves, where a bell chimes not to mark the hour, but to remind the air of its own stillness. Here, a priest moves without haste, lighting a lamp, offering flowers, chanting quietly, not for an audience, but for the act itself. And now, as your breath slows and the room settles, remember, the story does not end. It drifts, like mist on the surface of a river, like the scent of sandalwood in the evening air, like a song half remembered. It continues, gently, but not tonight. So let us lie still now. No need to remember every name. No need to place every date. Just drift with the rhythm of what has been. Let the slow story of India, not of its power, but of its persistence, rock you gently, like a boat on a calm river. We'll continue again another night. For now, just rest. The past is in no hurry. Good night, dear dreamer.